welcome back. And today we're going to talk a little bit about what it's like living in the Philippines as an expat. So we're going to talk about the pros and the cons of living in a foreign country. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Here we go. With the pandemic, it's changed the way people, they can enter the country. They have a hard time entering the Philippines now. So I think people who want to come and visit the Philippines, they must wait until the pandemic is over, until travel can arrive. But it's really interesting, the people who they come and retire. We got some people walking by here with some wood, and they can go ahead and you don't really know what it's like until you actually live there. And there's a survey that 70% of the expats who want to come to the Philippines and live, 70% of them actually don't make it and they go back home, and 30% stay. So let's talk about why the 30% stay. And we got some more workers right here, so we'll talk about that. You know, living in the Philippines is a lot different than dreaming of living in the Philippines. It's a lot different when you're living here versus you're dreaming of living here. And living in the Philippines is a lot different, like I mentioned, than dreaming of living in the Philippines. It's a lot different. And a lot of people do retire and live in the Philippines, and they have a really great life. People like to see if the grass is greener on the other side. The grass is green right there. And there's a white beach here too. But life is not perfect, right? There's pros and cons everywhere. And we're going to talk about the pros, and we're going to talk about the cons of living abroad, and see if you can handle it. Can you handle it? And most of the people who came visiting the Philippines in the past really had a good experience. They had a positive experience, and they go home and they're like, I like that place. But like anywhere else, it's a lot different living somewhere than just coming for 2 weeks on a vacation. And most retirees come to the Philippines for relationships, for women. And there's lots of good quality women in the Philippines, and it's really good. But there's a difference, right, in the culture. Man and woman, it's a lot different. But there's a lot of good quality women in the Philippines, and if you find a good Filipina, you know, you're pretty lucky. But like anywhere else, it's different living somewhere than just traveling and seeing it. You know, when you live here, it's just you have to learn how to just take it easy, to chill. You can't be high-strung, you can't be stressed out, you can't be thinking like, oh, well, my house is like this way. Because one thing you must remember about the Philippines is not going to change for you. You've got to change for the Philippines. So when you come to the Philippines, you'll have to learn how to adapt your culture, your lifestyle, and don't expect everyone to change for you. Maybe when you first visit the Philippines, it was charming, it was beautiful. You know, you would like see that funeral procession on the road, and you'd say to your girlfriend, oh, it's really nice. It's a beautiful funeral procession with the band marching on the street. It's really neat for the first time, and it's really interesting, and it's charming. However, but if you live in the Philippines after a while and it's the funeral processions marching in the street, it gets in your way, right? You're trying to travel somewhere and you can't. So it, you know, sometimes can get you upset. You're like, hey, I want to go. And so that the things that we first see as charming later may not be so charming. And the funeral processions and things like that, sometimes they lose their charm after a while. Also, there's a standard in the Philippines that everyone's usually 30 minutes or an hour late. So if you set up an appointment with somebody in the Philippines, especially a woman, expect them to be late. And usually the foreigners, they don't like that. I don't like that either. If I say I'm going to be somewhere at noon, I'm there at like 11:59, I'm waiting. And then it doesn't mean 1 o'clock. But in the Philippines, there's like a Philippine Standard Time. It's like, oh, it's like 1 hour late. So if you come to the Philippines and you want to meet someone, you better sometimes expect them to be late, because rarely they're on time. So it's called Philippine Standard Time. Woo! And there's a lot of like beggars in the Philippines outside of McDonald's and the malls. So you have to learn how to adjust sometimes, and you know, don't feel guilty sometimes if you don't have money to give, because they'll probably say a few bad words about you, but here in the Philippines, there's lots of, people that are like begging. And one time I was at a McDonald's late at night and there was kids outside. I'm shocked. I'm like, why aren't you home in bed? You need to be home with your parents. And they're begging. So in the Philippines, life is a lot different, especially now with the pandemic. And lots of foreigners that come to the Philippines and they say, I'm going to build a beautiful business. I'm going to make this business. And the problem is, in the Philippines, it's difficult, if not impossible, for foreigners to come and make a business. Everything has to be in a Philippine name. So you better have a wife, right? If you have a friend, maybe they take your business or whatever away. So if you have a business in the Philippines, it's difficult. Businesses back home are very difficult. But businesses in the Philippines are extremely difficult, especially now with the COVID thing. So if people come to the Philippines, they better expect to retire or have money coming in, because it's illegal for foreigners to start a business under their own name. You must be really patient when you come to the Philippines, because there's lots of things that are different than, let's say, back home. For example, the brownouts. They have brownouts all the time in the Philippines, and you must be patient. You must have backup like internet, maybe on your cell phone, or you must have a backup generator, because things happen suddenly and a lot, and people get mad. And so the thing is, you have to have patience living in the Philippines, because expect the worst, and the worst probably happens. So things are not perfect in the Philippines. So if you think that if it's the same as back home, you're wrong. And so in order to have a peaceful life in the Philippines, you have to kind of go with the flow. If you're driving the roads in the Philippines, you have to have patience too. People just come out in front of you. There's dogs, cats, kids, everything in the Philippines. It's a wild place. There's no laws as far as speeding. There's no drunk driving. The Philippines is a fun place actually to live, and it's a fun place to drive. But you have to have patience, because why? Because tricycle drivers will pull in front of you and almost kill you. So you have to just calm down, and you just have to go with the flow, because there's lots of obstacles in the Philippines, especially on the roads, and there's lots of obstacles everywhere on the road. Also, you have to learn how to adapt with the foods. The foods are different in the Philippines, right? And we don't have the same fast food restaurants in the Philippines as we do back home. So we have to learn how to eat different foods, adapt. I'm not really great about that, I must admit. I'm not really a good eater, because I've gotten sick before. So I'm kind of have trauma about some of the foods, but some of the foods are quite good. And you better be prepared to eat chicken and rice if you live in the Philippines. So learn how to adapt with the foods, and it's going to be a lot better. And if you're a foreigner living in the Philippines, you have to adapt of not having all the necessities, all the luxuries we have at home. We don't have garbage disposals in the Philippines. We don't know what that is. And there's lots of things we don't really have that, we have back home. Even the dishwashers, we don't really have dishwashers. The washing machines are real small. They're kind of cheap looking. And back home, we have some really nice, big, expensive washing machines and dryers. So in the Philippines, it's just things are a little different. So we must learn how to adapt, and we must realize it's not home, and it's not going to be like home. And nothing in the Philippines is going to be like what? Home. And living in the Philippines, we must enjoy the simple things. We must enjoy the little things. Life is slower in the Philippines, right? So we have to learn how to just enjoy the little things, the birds singing, the walking on the beach, like right here. We just have to learn how to enjoy different kinds of things. Life is much slower in the Philippines. And like I mentioned, the foods are a lot different in the Philippines, and the foods that we're used to, it's hard to get those foods. There is a place in a lot of the big cities called the S&R Food Club, and they have a lot of imports, and I like that place. And we miss a lot of the foods that we're used to eating. But if you live in the Philippines, you just have to eat what you can eat, like it's not going to be what you get every night in America or in the Western countries in Europe. So we have to learn how to adapt, and if we find a place that has our food, we have to go buy that food. And the money is no expense, buy that food. So living in the Philippines, we're not going to have the luxury of having the food that we're used to all the time. And I would say if you live in the Philippines, you must have like an emergency fund, right? You got to have money in case you have a major injury, you have to go to the hospital. In the Philippines, you can't come out of the hospital until you pay your bill. So you must have some money backup. You must have an emergency fund. It's very important. Just have some money in the bank so you know that if something happens to you, you go to the hospital or you get an injury or something, you have money to get out of the hospital. They hostage you in the hospital. You can't get out until you pay your bill. Living in the Philippines, it's like a paradise in many ways. Look at the trees, look at the sand. It's like a paradise. The Philippines is a gorgeous country and it's different. So when we come to the Philippines, like I mentioned before, we must learn to adapt to the Philippine culture, and the Philippine culture will never adapt to us. But it's just a beautiful paradise. And if you like paradise and you like a lot of good quality life, you come to the Philippines. Like I mentioned, you must be open-minded to live in the Philippines. You must be like lower key and not get so worried about the little things in life. And other things, it's just like, you know, do you get homesick? Do you get homesick of being home? And can you adapt to the different lifestyle in the Philippines? And do you plan to go home regular? You can't go home in the pandemic time or coming, but hopefully things are going to loosen up soon and travel will come in and out of the Philippines. And if you come and travel to the Philippines, you know, are you going to like living in the Philippines? Or are you going to get homesick? Living in the Philippines, only 30% of the expats actually stay in the Philippines. It's a gorgeous country, it's a beautiful place. You just have to learn how to adapt to it. And also it's important to be like retired so you have a cash flow coming in, because you can't work in the Philippines real easy. So thank you so much for hanging out with us in the Philippines. Beautiful country, it's gorgeous. So if you want to retire, the Philippines might be a place for you. And it's just a really great life in the Philippines. It costs a little lower than it does back home, wherever you're from. And it's just nice people. It's a good land, and it's beautiful, warm weather, beautiful beaches, warm water in the ocean right here. It's just a gorgeous place. So if you want to plan a retirement after the pandemic's over and travel can come in, the Philippines might be a place for you. So thank you so much, and we're gonna see you next time.